The train lurched to a grudging halt, exhaling steam into the frigid air of northern Canada, where the town of Colwood lay shrouded in a thick blanket of snow. Eleanor Briggs peered out from her compartment, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the small, isolated station materialize from the white swirl of the blizzard. Each snowflake that danced past her window seemed to carry its own whisper of the mysteries waiting in the frozen silence outside. With a heavy wool scarf wrapped tightly around her neck and her notebook clutched close to her chest, Eleanor stepped onto the snow-covered platform. The cold bit at her cheeks immediately, a raw, penetrating chill that seemed eager to welcome her into its domain. The town itself was a smattering of old wooden buildings, each one looking more like a relic of a forgotten gold rush era than a home for the few souls brave or desperate enough to inhabit such a place. Arthur Hayes was there to meet her, his figure emerging from the swirling snow like a specter. Tall, with a weathered face that spoke of winters endured and storms weathered, he regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and reserve. His eyes, a sharp blue, seemed to appraise her with a single glance. "You must be Miss Briggs," he said, his voice carrying the faint trace of an accent shaped by the wilderness. "Heard you might be coming. What brings a city girl like you to Colwood?" Eleanor smiled, extending a gloved hand, which he shook with a firm, brief grip. "I'm here to write, Mr. Hayes. About the town, its history, the occurrences that are said to happen here. I believe there's a story in Colwood that needs to be told." Arthur's gaze flickered toward the dense treeline that bordered the town, the dark wood seeming to watch and listen. "Stories, huh? Well, just be mindful that not all tales are eager to be shared." He led her down the main street, a path that seemed to be carved through towering drifts of snow. Eleanor noticed the curtains twitching in the windows as they passed, the town's residents peering out at the newcomer who dared tread into their secluded world. "Most here prefer to forget the past, not dredge it up," Arthur continued, his voice barely above the crunch of their boots on the packed snow. "But if it's stories you're after, you'll find plenty. Just be careful with them." As they walked, Eleanor's reporter instincts kicked in, her keen senses picking up the undercurrents of unease that seemed to permeate the town. She noted the way Arthur's gaze often darted to the shadows as if he expected them to stir. The quiet was pervasive, almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that howled down from the mountains like the mournful cry of a lost soul. Arriving at a small inn that looked as though it had seen better centuries, Arthur held the door for her, the warmth from inside greeting them like a soft sigh. "This will be your place while you're here," he said. "I'll introduce you to some folks, get you started. After that, you're on your own." Inside, the inn was a rustic maze of timber, the air thick with the scent of pine and the smoky whispers from a large stone fireplace. The innkeeper, a stout woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner, gave Eleanor a nod of welcome, if not exactly warmth. "Miss Briggs, was it?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of both interest and caution. "Heard you might stir things up around here. Just remember, we like our peace, even if it's a bit shadowed." Eleanor thanked her, reassured her of her good intentions, and after settling into her modest room, she unpacked her belongings, the tools of her trade that would help her peel back the layers of Colwood's enigmatic past. She sat at the small desk by the window, her notebook open, pen poised, ready to record every detail, every secret this town was willing to reveal. As night fell and the shadows deepened, Eleanor felt the edge of the unknown brushing against her, the whisper of something ancient and hidden stirring in the cold darkness outside her window. Colwood, she realized, was more than just a town. It was a story, a living, breathing tale waiting to be told. And she would be the one to tell it. The dawn crept slowly over Colwood, struggling against the persistent winter gloom that clung to the rooftops like a stubborn shroud. Eleanor awoke to the sound of a muted world, where the snow absorbed the usual morning bustle, leaving a hushed silence in its wake. Her first morning in Colwood felt surreal, the chilling solitude of the town seeping into her bones as she gazed out her frost-etched window. She dressed warmly, her mind replaying the curt welcomes and veiled warnings from the previous evening. The villagers' guarded demeanor intrigued her, hinting at stories buried as deep as the snow that blanketed the ground. With a scarf pulled tight and her notebook tucked under her arm, Eleanor set out to meet the heart of Coldwood. Her steps led her first to the small diner that served as a morning gathering place for the town. The warmth that greeted her as she entered was tinged with the rich aromas of coffee and pine, and the murmur of hushed conversations. The locals eyed her arrival with a mixture of curiosity and caution, their gazes lingering just long enough to communicate their wariness. Eleanor chose a corner table, her back to the wall, allowing her an unobstructed view of the room. The waitress, a young woman with sharp eyes and a tentative smile, brought her a cup of coffee. "You're the writer, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "People here don't much like their secrets dug up." "I'm here to listen," Eleanor reassured her, offering a gentle smile. "Every place has its stories. I just want to give Coldwood a voice." The waitress nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, but her eyes flickered to a table across the room where an elderly man sat alone, his face marked by time and his eyes lost in thought. "That's old man Carver," she whispered. "If anyone's got stories, it's him. But be careful, some doors are best left closed." Thanking the waitress, Eleanor sipped her coffee, her gaze fixed on the enigmatic figure of old man Carver. After gathering her resolve, she approached him, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. "Mr. Carver?" she began, her voice respectful. "I'm Eleanor Briggs. I've heard you might share some of Coldwood's history with me." The old man lifted his gaze slowly, studying her with a discerning eye. After a long pause, he nodded, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Sit down, Mississippi. I can tell you tales of Coldwood, but not all have happy endings." For the next hour, Eleanor listened, captivated, as Carver spun tales of Coldwood's heyday during the gold rush, of prosperity and ruin, and of something darker that seemed to weave through his narrative. "The land here isn't like other places," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's older, hungrier. We've seen things in the woods that don't care for human claims or desires." His words sent a chill through Eleanor that wasn't from the cold. She noted everything, his stories painting a picture of a town shadowed by more than its geographical isolation. Leaving the diner, Eleanor decided to walk the perimeter of the town. As she passed the treeline where the wilderness began, the sense of being watched returned. She stopped, her breath visible in the air, and looked into the woods. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a darker shadow against the dark woods, but when she blinked, it was gone. Shaking off the unease, Eleanor continued her walk, her mind piecing together the snippets of history and rumor. Coldwood was a puzzle, and every shadowed corner and whispered story was a piece she needed. The deeper she delved, the more she understood that beneath the surface of this quiet town lay secrets that some might go to great lengths to keep. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow, Eleanor felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. Tonight she would revisit her notes, trying to weave together the strands of narrative she'd collected. Coldwood had opened its doors just a crack, and through that sliver, she glimpsed the outlines of a story as enigmatic as the whispering woods themselves. Morning's light had barely touched the sky when Eleanor, wrapped in layers against the biting cold, made her way back to the heart of Coldwood. The previous day's encounters had left her mind swirling with fragments of whispered lore and shadowed histories. Today, she hoped to unearth more, to connect the dots that old man Carver's stories had scattered in her thoughts. Her destination was the town's modest library, a relic from a bygone era when the gold rush promised prosperity and brought with it a hunger for knowledge and new beginnings. The building stood at the edge of town, its wooden facade weathered by the relentless winters, but its structure sound and welcoming. Inside, the library was a warm haven of musty book smells and the soft ticking of an old grandfather clock. The librarian, Mrs. Alder, a woman as aged and sturdy as the shelves that lined the room, greeted Eleanor with a nod of recognition. Back again, Miss Briggs? You do have an appetite for our dusty old tales, she remarked, her voice a crackling whisper that matched the creak of the floorboards. Eleanor smiled, approaching the counter. There's much to learn about Coldwood. I'm hoping to find more on the town's early days, anything that might speak of the occurrences mentioned by the townsfolk. Mrs. Alder studied her for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion but in calculation. You might want to look at the journals of Jacob Whitmore. He was a miner who turned to chronicling the town's fortunes when the gold began to dwindle. Saw a lot, he did. More than he wished, some said. Thanking her, Eleanor moved to the section Mrs. Alder had indicated. The journals were leather-bound and brittle, their pages yellowed with age but still legible. She carefully opened the cover of the first volume, her eyes scanning the neat script. As she read, the tales woven by Old Man Carver began to find echoes in Whitmore's writings. He spoke of the land with a reverence tinged with fear, detailing strange occurrences that defied simple explanation, shadows that moved against the wind, whispers in languages long forgotten, and the inexplicable disappearance of men who ventured too deep into the woods. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she turned the pages, the chill of the library now seeming to seep deeper into her bones. Whitmore's last entry caught her attention, the script shakier, more urgent. The land does not forgive. We have delved too greedily, too deep, and awakened that which should have remained hidden. I fear for what we have unleashed here, for the darkness does not recede, it only grows hungrier. The words resonated with a grim foreboding, and as Eleanor closed the journal, her resolve hardened. She needed to understand what had been awakened, what still lingered in the shadowed woods surrounding Coldwood. She gathered the journals, intending to study them in the seclusion of her room where she could piece together the fragmented history into a coherent narrative. Exiting the library, the sun was now fully risen, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper of the hidden dangers that Old Man Carver and Jacob Whitmore had hinted at. The air felt charged, the usual daytime bustle of the town muted, as if under a spell of waiting, of anticipation for something inevitable. Eleanor walked back to her lodging, the journals under her arm, feeling like the pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, would reveal a picture both terrifying and necessary to understand. Tonight she would delve deeper into Coldwood's secrets, armed with the knowledge that what she might uncover could change her understanding of the town, and perhaps of what lurked in the human soul, forever. As nightfall embraced Coldwood, the wind carried a sharper chill, whispering through the narrow streets as if it bore secrets too dark for daylight. Eleanor Briggs sat at the small desk in her room, the journals of Jacob Whitmore spread out before her, their pages rustling softly under her trembling fingers. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows that seemed to play out the eerie tales inked in the aged script. She began with the earliest entries, tracing Whitmore's journey from an optimistic miner to a haunted chronicler. The transition in his writing was palpable. The early joyous recounting of gold discoveries slowly warped into troubled notes on inexplicable events that began to plague the camp. His entries spoke of men who wandered into the woods, drawn by a lullaby only they could hear, never to return. Others woke from dreams screaming, terrified by visions of a shadowed figure watching from the trees. Eleanor annotated the margins with her observations, linking incidents and dates, her reporter's instinct piecing together a timeline of terror. As she delved deeper, a pattern emerged, a crescendo of occurrences every 50 years, aligning with the town's most tragic events, unexplained plagues, fires, and mass disappearances. Her breath caught as she realized the next recurrence was due this very winter. The sound of a floorboard creaking outside her room jolted Eleanor from her thoughts. She tensed, listening, but only the wind's mournful howl answered back. Shaking off the unease, she returned to Whitmore's most disturbing entries, those filled with his frantic theories of what he called the curse of the Coldwood depths. According to Whitmore, the miners had uncovered something ancient and malevolent deep within the earth, something that should have remained buried. He wrote of an artifact, a darkly gleaming stone etched with indecipherable runes, unearthed in the deepest mine shaft. The day after its discovery, the shadows began to move with intent, and the wood's whispers grew into screams. Eleanor's eyes widened as she connected the artifact to the ritualistic symbols she'd seen etched around the town, symbols that now seemed to be not merely decorative but part of a larger, more sinister rite. She sketched the symbols next to Whitmore's descriptions, her mind racing as the pieces of this dark puzzle slid into place. Her focus was so intense that she scarcely noticed the room growing colder until her breath fogged the air. With a start, she realized that the temperature had dropped unnaturally. The candle flickered violently, as though agitated by an unseen presence. Heart pounding, Eleanor stood and moved to the window, peering into the night. Outside, the moon cast a pale light over Coldwood, the shadows of the trees stretching towards the town like dark fingers. It was then she saw it, a fleeting shape, darker than the night, moving with purpose through the woods. The sight of it chilled her to the bone, not because of what she clearly saw, but because of what it implied. Eleanor sat back down, her resolve steeling. She knew that understanding Coldwood's curse was no longer just about writing a story. It was about preventing whatever Whitmore had feared most from reawakening. She needed to warn Arthur, to show him what she had discovered, but part of her feared that they were already too late. The shadows were moving, stirred by an ancient call that might not be silenced again. She gathered the journals, wrapped herself in her coat, and stepped out into the cold night, determined to find Arthur and confront the darkness that lurked in Coldwood. The wind seemed to echo with the whispers of the past, each step she took resonating with the weight of the town's hidden truths. Tonight, she thought grimly, Coldwood's echoes would either be silenced or scream into the darkness, and she would be there to listen. The crunch of Eleanor's boots on the freshly fallen snow punctuated the eerie silence as she made her way to Arthur's cabin. Her mind raced with the revelations from Whitmore's journals, each step bringing her deeper into the labyrinth of Coldwood's cursed past. The chilling wind seemed to carry voices, a cacophony of whispers from those long lost to the woods. Arriving at Arthur's cabin, she found the door slightly ajar, an unusual oversight for a man as cautious as Arthur. Pushing it open, the warmth of the hearth fought off the biting cold that clung to her skin. "Arthur?" she called into the dimly lit interior, her voice steadier than she felt. The only response was the crackling of the fire and the soft creak of the wood settling. Stepping inside, Eleanor's eyes adjusted to the low light, scanning the room for any sign of Arthur. The cabin was orderly, with tools hung meticulously on the walls and the remains of a meal on the table, indicating a hasty departure. A sense of urgency tightened in her chest as she considered the implications of his absence. She moved to the fireplace, her hands extended towards the warmth. That's when she noticed it, the edge of a map sticking out from under a stack of papers on Arthur's desk. Pulling it gently free, she spread it on the table, her eyes tracing the lines and notes that Arthur had scribbled across the landscape of Coldwood. A particular area was circled in red, deep in the forest, marked ominously with the words, "Do not enter." The map in hand, Eleanor felt a decision settle within her. She would go to this place, find Arthur, and confront whatever darkness was stirring in the heart of the woods. Wrapping herself even tighter against the cold, she prepared to leave when a soft thud from the back of the cabin made her pause. Slowly, cautiously, she approached the source of the sound, her heart pounding in her ears. In the small back room, she found a window ajar, the curtains fluttering like ghostly fingers in the breeze. As she closed it, her gaze caught on something in the snow outside, a set of fresh tracks leading away from the cabin, deeper into the forest. They were Arthur's. The tread pattern of his boots was unmistakable. With no time to lose, Eleanor grabbed a lantern, the map, and a heavy walking stick. Stepping back into the cold night, she followed the tracks, her lantern casting eerie shadows on the snow-laden trees. The forest seemed alive, each rustle and crack magnifying her fears, but her resolve pushed her forward. As she ventured deeper, The forest canopy thickened, swallowing her in darkness that even the lantern light could not penetrate. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into her very bones, sapping her strength. Every so often, she thought she heard a voice, soft and melodic, calling her name from the shadows. Shivering, she pressed on, the words from Whitmore's journal echoing in her mind. "The land does not forgive." Suddenly, the trees opened into a clearing, and she halted, breath catching in her throat. Before her lay the remnants of an old mining camp, the structures dilapidated and overgrown. But it was what stood in the center of the clearing that drew her horrified gaze. A dark, gaping mine entrance loomed, its maw open as if waiting to swallow her whole. Beside it knelt Arthur, his head bowed, unmoving. "Arthur!" Eleanor rushed to his side, her relief at finding him alive quickly turning to concern as she saw his pale, drawn face. He looked up at her, his eyes haunted. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's starting again, Eleanor. The cycle, the whispers didn't lie." As they spoke, a soft, lilting melody filled the air, the same one that haunted Eleanor's steps. It was coming from the mine, a siren song that beckoned them closer. Eleanor gripped the walking stick tighter, her other hand reaching out to Arthur, helping him to his feet. Together they faced the darkness of the mine, the map's warning etched in red burned into Eleanor's mind. Whatever secrets Coldwood held, whatever curse they were under, it was here, in the depths of the earth, that they would find their answers. The whispers grew louder, and hand in hand, they stepped toward the mine, into the heart of Coldwood's shadows, ready to face whatever awaited them in the echoing dark. Under the spectral glow of Eleanor's lantern, the entrance to the old mine yawned before them, an abyssal mouth agape with centuries of silence. The air that emanated from its depths carried a chill sharper than the winter's bite outside, laden with the scent of damp earth and the iron tang of old, unseen fears. Arthur's hand tightened on Eleanor's as they stood at the threshold, his face pale but resolute. "This is where it all began," he murmured, his voice a ragged whisper barely audible over the haunting melody that seemed to seep from the stones themselves. "And where it must end, one way or another." Eleanor nodded, her resolve steeling against the invisible weight of dread that pressed down on her. "We need to find the source of these occurrences," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Whatever Whitmore unleashed, whatever these cycles of tragedy are tied to, it's down there." With a collective breath, they stepped forward, crossing the ancient timbers that framed the mine's entrance. Inside, the passage narrowed quickly, the walls rough-hewn and slick with moisture. Their lantern cast long, dancing shadows that twisted and writhed like dark spirits in the flickering light. As they descended, the incline steepened, and the melody grew louder, more insistent. It was as though the mine itself was alive, its voice a siren call that resonated with an eerie familiarity that tugged at Eleanor's memory. "Do you hear that?" she asked, pausing to listen. "The song, it's not just in our heads. It's here, in the rocks, in the air." Arthur nodded grimly. "It's been said that the mine sings on the nights when the shadows grow hungry. My father told me stories, legends he thought were just old miners' superstitions. Now I'm not so sure." Their path led them deeper into the earth, through tunnels that branched and twisted like the roots of an ancient tree. Here and there, remnants of the mine's operation lay abandoned, a rusted pickaxe, a broken ore cart, its contents long since spilled and blended back into the earth. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a vast cavern, the ceiling lost to shadows far above. In the center, bathed in a pool of moonlight that seemed impossible so far underground, stood the artifact that Whitmore had described, a dark stone, its surface etched with runes that shimmered with an otherworldly light. Eleanor approached, her heart pounding in her chest as the stones seemed to pulse in response to their presence. The melody was deafening here, each note vibrating through the air with palpable energy. "This is it," she breathed, reaching out to trace the runes with a tentative finger. The symbols were unlike any she had seen, complex, interlocking patterns that spoke of an ancient wisdom and a deep, abiding power. As her finger touched the stone, the air in the cavern shifted, a sudden silence falling so heavy they could hear their own breaths echoing back at them. Then, without warning, the ground trembled, a low rumble that grew into a roar as the walls began to shake. "We need to get out!" Arthur shouted, grabbing Eleanor's arm. But as they turned to run, the way they had come was blocked by a collapse, the tunnel choked with rubble. Panic rose like bile in Eleanor's throat, but as she turned back to the stone, the runes glowed brighter, and a new path opened on the opposite side of the cavern, a narrow, upward-leading tunnel that had not been there before. With no other choice, they fled toward the new passage, the stones hum a beacon that guided their desperate escape. Behind them, the cavern continued to collapse, a testament to the dangerous power they had awoken. Climbing the steep tunnel, they emerged into the cold night air on the other side of the mountain, the forest of Coldwood dark and silent around them. They had escaped the immediate danger, but the mystery of the stone and the song it held remained, a puzzle whose pieces were scattered across the history of Coldwood. As they made their way back to the village, the weight of their discovery hung between them, a shared burden that would define their next steps. The cycle of shadows had been disturbed, and now they had to prepare for whatever would come next. The night was still, the melody gone, but the echo of its tune lingered in their minds, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lay just beneath the surface. The night air bit into their skin as Eleanor and Arthur emerged from the hidden passage, the unforeseen exit bringing them out near the edge of Coldwood. Their breaths visible in the frigid air, they paused, taking a moment to orient themselves in the dark landscape transformed by their harrowing journey beneath it. "Everything feels different," Eleanor murmured, her eyes scanning the darkened tree line that bordered the village. "Even the night doesn't seem as silent as it used to be." Arthur nodded, his gaze distant. "We've stirred something ancient, Eleanor. The stone, those runes, they weren't just left there by chance. This was a seal, and we might have broken it." As they trudged through the thick snow back toward the village, Eleanor replayed the day's discoveries in her mind. The melody had ceased, yet its echo haunted her, a spectral melody that seemed to weave through the very air. "Do you think it's over?" she asked, her voice tinged with hope yet heavy with doubt. Arthur shook his head, his expression grave. "No, I fear our actions tonight are just the beginning. Whatever was contained by that stone might now be free. We need to warn the others, prepare them for what might come." Their pace quickened as the familiar lights of the village came into view, casting a soft glow that felt both welcoming and eerily foreboding. As they entered the village, the sense of an impending storm grew palpable, the air charged with a silent tension. They headed straight for the local meeting hall, a place where decisions were made and news was shared. Arthur pushed open the heavy wooden door, and together they entered, finding several of the village elders already gathered around the long, weathered table that dominated the room. Their faces turned towards Eleanor and Arthur, marked by lines of concern and curiosity. "What's happened?" demanded Mayor Thompson, a sturdy man with a voice that commanded attention. "We heard rumblings from the old mine just before sunset. The ground shook like something out of the old stories." Arthur stepped forward, his voice firm despite the fatigue that shadowed his features. "It's worse than we feared," he began, and Eleanor joined him at his side, pulling out the map and spreading it across the table. "We found something in the mine, an artifact with ancient runes. It's connected to the cycles of tragedy this town has suffered." Eleanor took over, explaining the synchronization of the events with the cycles they pieced together from Whitmore's journals. The elders listened, their skepticism slowly giving way to a dawning realization as the historical patterns aligned too neatly with the present disturbances. "We believe we might have triggered something tonight," Eleanor concluded, her hands flat against the map as if to steady herself against the weight of their discovery. "Something that was meant to stay buried." Silence settled over the hall, heavy and thoughtful. Finally, it was Mrs. Alder who spoke, her voice a whisper that seemed to echo the fear all felt. "What do we do now?" We prepare, Arthur said decisively. We fortify the town. We look into every book, every scroll that might tell us how to deal with what's coming. And we stay vigilant. Night and day we watch. And we'll need to understand more about this artifact, added Eleanor. I'll go back to the library first thing in the morning. There has to be more. Perhaps something we missed that can tell us how to seal it again. The meeting stretched into the early hours, plans slowly forming out of the fog of uncertainty and fear. As the village of Coldwood braced itself against the unknown, Eleanor felt a resolve harden within her. This story, her story, was no longer just about uncovering the past. It was about securing a future. Exhausted but unable to sleep, she left the meeting hall with Arthur, the weight of their shared secret binding them together. As they stepped out into the cold night, the first snowflakes of an impending blizzard began to fall, veiling the darkened world in white, as if to cover the shadows they had stirred in the depths of the earth. As dawn broke over Coldwood, a blanket of heavy snow muffled the world in a hushed, eerie quiet. The first light of morning filtered through thick clouds, casting a pallid glow over the village, now bracing against both the storm and the unknown darkness they feared loomed on the horizon. Eleanor, her resolve as icy as the wind that whipped around her, made her way through the snow-choked streets toward the library. Each step was a struggle against the growing drifts, but her determination burned bright within her, a beacon against the shadow that had fallen over Coldwood. The library's doors creaked ominously as she pushed them open, the familiar scent of old books and a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The warmth inside was a small comfort as she shed her snow-laden coat, her mind racing with the urgency of the task at hand. Mrs. Alder was already there, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders as she sorted through a pile of ancient texts. "Back so soon, Miss Briggs?" she called out, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet, almost reverent atmosphere of the library. "Yes, there's no time to waste," Eleanor replied, her voice firm. "We need to find anything that might tell us more about the artifact and how to deal with what's coming. Arthur and the others are fortifying the town, but if we don't find a way to seal whatever we've unleashed, it may not be enough." Mrs. Alder nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I've pulled every book that might have something. Old mining logs, diaries, even some of the original land grants. Anything that could give us a clue." Together, they dove into the stacks, poring over dusty tomes and brittle maps. Hours passed as they searched, the wind howling outside like a wild thing clawing at the walls. Finally, Eleanor's fingers brushed against a leather-bound volume hidden beneath a stack of weathered mining company records. Pulling it out, she blew off a layer of dust, revealing a faded title. "Rituals and Lore of the Northern Territories." Her heart quickened as she flipped through the pages, stopping on a section marked by an old, dried-out leaf. "Mrs. Alder, look at this," Eleanor said, her voice a mix of excitement and fear. The page described a ritual used by early settlers to ward off what they called the darkness beneath the earth. It spoke of a ceremonial stone similar to the one they found, used to seal away ancient evils unearthed by greed. "This could be it," Eleanor breathed, her eyes scanning the intricate details of the ritual. "It says here we need something from the land itself, something that was never touched by human hands, to complete the sealing." As they considered what that could mean, the library door flew open with a gust of wind, and Arthur stepped inside, snow swirling around him. "The whole town's on edge," he said, brushing the snow from his shoulders. "We've seen shadows moving at the edge of the woods, and the whispers are getting louder, even over the storm." Eleanor showed him the book, explaining her find. "We need to perform this ritual, Arthur. It's the only way to ensure that whatever is stirring doesn't break free." Arthur looked from the book to Eleanor, his face set in a grim line. "Then we'll need to find whatever it is the ritual requires. The heart of the land, perhaps something from the deepest part of the forest, where no one has ever logged or mined." With the blizzard intensifying outside, the trio prepared to venture into the forest, equipped with the knowledge of the old rites and a desperate hope that they could restore the seal before the darkness engulfed their town. As they donned their winter gear, Eleanor felt the weight of their mission pressing down on her. "This storm," she said, looking out at the swirling snow. "It's like the land itself is trying to bury its secrets once again." And with that they stepped out into the white fury of the blizzard, the pages of the ancient book tucked safely under Eleanor's arm, their hearts heavy with the burden of their task, as they went to confront the heart of Coldwood's darkness. The blizzard swirled around them with ferocious intensity as Eleanor, Arthur, and Mrs. Alder trudged through the thickening snow toward the heart of the forest. The wind howled like a chorus of wraiths, each gust threatening to erase the faint path they followed. Despite the storm's fury, their destination drew them onward, a grove deep within the woods, untouched and reputed to be the purest part of Coldwood. Eleanor's thoughts churned as fast as the snowflakes swirling around them. The ancient ritual described in the book required an element from the land that had never been tainted by human hands. According to local legend, the grove was such a place said to be protected by spirits of the forest that repelled all human corruption. Arthur led the way, his figure a shadow against the white curtain of snow. His familiarity with the land was their compass in the blinding storm. Mrs. Alder, though the oldest of the trio, moved with a determination that belied her age, her knowledge of Coldwood's lore a beacon as vital as any physical light. As they neared the grove, a strange calm began to fall over the area. The trees here were ancient, their massive trunks and sprawling branches forming a natural barrier that the wind and snow could not penetrate. The air within the grove was still, the silence profound compared to the chaos of the storm they had just passed through. "This is it," Arthur said softly, his voice barely above a whisper as if to honor the sanctity of the place. The snow underfoot was undisturbed, pristine in its untouched beauty. The atmosphere was reverent, almost sacred, and Eleanor felt a chill that had little to do with the cold. They moved to the center of the grove, where a small clearing opened up to the sky. Here, the moon shone down, a sliver of silver light illuminating a stone altar, ancient and moss-covered, but clearly hewn by hands long forgotten. This was their focus, the heart of the ritual. Eleanor opened the book to the page describing the ritual and laid it on the altar. The symbols in the book matched those carved into the stone, confirming they were in the right place. With careful reverence, she arranged the items they had brought, a circle of salt, to purify and protect, candles, to light their prayers, and a collection of herbs known for their spiritual properties, gathered by Mrs. Alder from around the village. "We must each offer something," Eleanor instructed, her voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. Following the ritual's directions, they each placed a personal item into the center of the circle, a locket from Eleanor, a knife from Arthur, and a rosary from Mrs. Alder, each item a symbol of their willingness to protect Coldwood. Then they joined hands, forming a chain of unity, and began to chant the words Eleanor read aloud from the book. The language was ancient, likely a dialect of the early settlers mixed with older tongues, and as they spoke, the air around them began to shimmer, charged with an unseen energy. The ground trembled, a gentle rumble that echoed the beating of their hearts. As the chanting grew louder, the wind seemed to rise in response, the trees bending as though bowing to some invisible force. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stilled, the air, the wind, the very essence of the forest holding its breath. Eleanor felt a surge of power rush through them, a wave of warmth that belied the cold air. The items they had offered burned brightly for a moment on the altar, then turned to ash, a sign of acceptance. "We've done it," Arthur said, his voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. "We've restored the seal." The grove remained silent, a sacred stillness that felt like a blessing. They took a moment to acknowledge the weight of what they had achieved, the potential disaster they might have averted. With reverent steps, they left the clearing, the grove unchanged yet somehow transformed. As they emerged from the forest, the blizzard had ceased, the clouds parting to reveal a starlit sky. The darkness that had once felt oppressive now seemed a bit lighter, the shadows less menacing. They knew the dangers were not over. Colwood would always be a land of deep mysteries and ancient secrets. But for now, they had restored balance. They walked back to the village, not as individuals but as guardians of Colwood, united by a shared secret and a common purpose. In the heart of the forest, they had found more than an ancient altar. They had discovered a renewed commitment to protect their home, come what may. The echoes of the past would always whisper through the woods, but Eleanor, Arthur, and Mrs. Alder had ensured that for now, the whispers would speak of peace. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the residents of Colwood began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the sudden stillness that had replaced the blizzard's fury. The village, blanketed in a thick layer of snow, appeared transformed, as if washed clean by the storm. Eleanor, Arthur, and Mrs. Alder walked back into town, their steps lighter, their spirits cautiously lifted by the success of their nocturnal venture. The village square, usually quiet at this early hour, was slowly filling with people, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and curiosity. Word of the ritual and its apparent success had spread quickly, whispered through the town like a restoring breeze. Mayor Thompson was waiting for them, his robust figure a stark contrast against the pristine snow. He approached with a brisk stride, his eyes searching theirs for confirmation. "Is it done then? Are we safe?" he asked, his voice carrying a hopeful note that was rare in these parts. Arthur nodded, offering a tired smile. "We've done everything we could. The seal should hold, stronger than before. But we'll need to remain vigilant. We can't forget what happened, nor how close we came to a darker fate." Eleanor stepped forward, feeling the weight of the village's gaze upon her. "The rituals and the knowledge we've uncovered in the process will be documented and preserved. This must become part of Colwood's lore, taught to every generation so that the past does not repeat itself." The mayor clasped her hand in both of his gratitude palpable. "You have given us more than just safety, you've given us a future. We'll start preparations today to ensure that this knowledge is never lost again." As the crowd began to disperse, returning to the rhythm of their daily lives with renewed hope, Eleanor, Arthur, and Mrs. Alder made their way to the local cafe, a place that had become a sanctuary of sorts during their ordeal. Over cups of steaming coffee, they discussed the future. "We need to strengthen the bonds within Colwood," Arthur said, looking out the window at the snow-covered streets. "Not just the physical structures, but the community itself. We faced this together, and that unity saved us." Mrs. Alder, ever the historian, added, "I'll organize a committee to oversee the collection of all relevant documents and artifacts. We'll create a permanent archive here, in the heart of the town. Our history is our strength." Eleanor listened to them, feeling a profound connection to the town that had once been just the subject of her stories. Now, she was part of its story, intertwined with its fate. She pulled out her notebook, the pages filled with notes, sketches, and now, the components of a ritual that had saved a town. She began to write, not just to record, but to reflect on the journey. "This isn't just the end of our ordeal, it's the beginning of a new chapter," she mused aloud. "One where Colwood not only survives but thrives, aware of its shadows but not overpowered by them." Arthur and Mrs. Alder nodded, their expressions somber but hopeful. They understood the balance they had struck, a harmony between the darkness lurking beneath and the community that stood vigilant above. As the day brightened, the snow glistening under the rising sun, the people of Colwood moved through their village with a new sense of purpose. Children played, their laughter a light melody against the backdrop of the forest's whispered echoes. And in those echoes, there was peace, a testament to the courage and unity of a small village that had faced the darkness and prevailed. Eleanor closed her notebook, her heart full. She knew she would write their story, a tale of darkness, of fear, but more importantly, of resilience and light. And as she wrote, she would look out over the village of Colwood, her home, forever a part of its legend, its guardian of memories and protector of its truths. Thank you for sharing a moment of your day with me. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Really helps a lot. If you don't, well, I'll still love you. Thanks for stopping by.